In May of 1942, Colonel General Erwin Rommel, commanding the Africa Corps, did not want to repeat the same mistakes made during the Axis offensive in the Western Desert the year before, when the key port fortress of Tobruk was bypassed and became a thorn on the side of the dwindling German advance towards the Nile. This time, Rommel was bent on taking Tobruk, and the Allies were determined to deny him such prize once again. The British Eighth Army, composed of British, New Zealanders, Indians, South Africans, and French troops, had superior firepower, with around 100,000 men and 849 tanks. Rommel, on the other hand, had 90,000 men and 560 tanks, of which only 332 were German panzers. The British tanks were mostly Matildas, Valentines, and the light Stuarts, but they had received a shipment of American Grant tanks, armed with 2 guns, including a powerful 75mm gun, which could certainly stand up to the German Panzer Mark IIIs and Mark IVs. Rommel had a marked advantage in air power, 497 planes compared to 320 for the British, of which only 190 were serviceable. The Germans, although shortchanged in armor, did have a powerful and formidable weapon in the flak 88mm anti-air and anti-tank gun, which could penetrate the thickest armor the Allies could throw at them. The British, however, had not been idle waiting for Rommel. An elaborate web of minefields, strongpoints, and barbed wire was set up around and in front of Tobruk. Places such as the Cauldron, Rigel Ridge, and Bir Hakeim, defended by a lone Free French brigade, would become synonymous with gallantry and bravery for men of both sides. The Allies were confident and ready this time to stop the Desert Fox in his tracks. However, they were about to experience the cunning, skill, and genius of Rommel at Gazala. Rommel at Gazala is a 2-player game about the 1942 Gazala offensive in the Western Desert in World War II, where one player controls the Africa Corps, commanded by General Erwin Rommel, and the other player commands the British Eighth Army, with the formidable task of stopping the Desert Fox and preventing the fall of the critical fortified port of Tobruk. The game includes the following components: one 22 by 17-inch cardstock map divided in 2 sections, one counter sheet with 88 5/8 of an inch counters, one player aid card, one terrain effects chart, a 6-sided die, and one Ziploc bag to store the counters. The map shows the area around Tobruk, including the formidable Gazala line with its minefields and strongpoints. Each hex on the map represents 3 miles, and each turn 2 days. The key port fortress of Tobruk is the prize, and around the port is a fortified line printed in red. Units inside the line zone have their combat factors doubled on defense against any attacks from outside. There's also escarpment terrain and also box hexes, which are strong points. From north to south and west of Tobruk are scores of minefields represented in the game by minefield hex sites. The Africa Corps is represented by German and Italian units. German units are printed in a dark gray background, while their Italian allies are printed in dark green. Some Italian units are infantry divisions, but most of the Axis units are regiments. The British 8th Army units are all printed in brown. Let's take a look at the units in the game. The Africa Corps is composed of German and Italian units. The German units are printed in a dark gray background and the Italian units in dark green. British 8th Army units are printed in brown, with the exception of the Free French Brigade, which is printed in blue. Let's take a look at the different unit types. In the Africa Corps, there is a number of Italian infantry divisions, which tend to be slow, with a movement factor of 6. There are also motorized infantry units like the Trieste Motorized Infantry Division with an increased movement factor of 9. Also present in the game are mechanized infantry units. For the Germans, these are called Panzer Grenadiers, like this regiment of the 90th Light Division. And then there's tank units. On the German side, these are called Panzer units. On the British side, they're called armored units. All tank units have a special bonus. They provide a 1-column shift in attack to the right or in defense to the left whenever the enemies that they are attacking or defending from have no tank units. In the British 8th Army, there are some special tank units. These are the infantry support tanks, and these units confer 1-column shift to the right when attacking, and that is in addition to the armored bonus that we spoke of before. The Africa Corps also has 1 anti-aircraft battalion and an anti-tank battalion. These units don't count for stacking purposes, and if present in a hex when defending, they cancel any British armor bonus column shift as well as any infantry support tank column shift. Unsupplied units have their combat factors halved, fractions rounded down. And to mark their status, we place an unsupplied marker on the unit. Allied supply sources are hexes on the eastern edge of the map. Those are hex 3406, hex 3409, and further to the south, hex 3415. Axis supply sources are hex 1501, and on the western edge, hex 1002, hex 1004, and further south, hex 1009. Note that all supply sources are hexes which have roads connected to them which lead off the map. In this game, there's also limited supply sources. Box hexes, like the one shown here in Knightsbridge, can supply 1 Allied unit. The fortified line zone of Tobruk is another limited supply source, and it can provide supply to any Allied unit inside the zone. Axis units, like the one shown here, cannot trace supply across a minefield hex site unless a gap exists in the hex site. Supply lines are blocked by enemy units or their zones of control. Here, this infantry support tank unit is surrounded by enemy zones of control, and therefore it would be unsupplied during the next supply phase. However, if another British unit would be adjacent to it, like the one shown here, supply can be traced through that unit because friendly units negate enemy zones of control for purposes of retreats and supplies. As to stacking in this game, the maximum limit of units present in a hex is a division. And here, for example, we see the Italian Brescia Infantry Division. Regiments cost a third of a division for stacking purposes, and therefore we can stack 3 regiments in a single hex. Like here we see all 3 regiments of the 21st Panzer Division. The Rommel headquarters unit, as well as the anti-tank and anti-aircraft battalions that the Africa Corps has, do not count for stacking purposes and can be freely added to any stack. In this game, minefields are represented by minefield hex sides, which affect the Africa Corps player. To cross a minefield hex side, an Axis unit pays half of its movement allowance with fractions rounded up. So in this example, let's say that this Italian motorized infantry division wants to cross this minefield hex side. It pays 1 for the initial hex, 5 movement points for the hex side, plus 1 for the newly entered hex. So the unit has spent 7 movement points. There is a way to clear the minefields, or at least attempt to do so. For that, a unit must start its turn adjacent to a minefield hex side and declare that it will attempt to find a gap through the minefields. The unit rolls a 1d6, and if a 1 is rolled, a mine gap marker is placed facing the hex side that has been cleared. Then in the next turn, this unit and other Axis units can cross the minefield hex side without paying the enormous cost in movement points to do so. An important tactic in this game is the Overrun, which is a form of combat that occurs during the movement phase. Here we see a line of British units in front of the German 21st Panzer Division, which is fully concentrated. It is the Axis player turn, the movement phase, and the 21st Division moves 2 hexes, entering the zone of control of a British infantry brigade. Having spent 2 movement points, the Axis player declares an overrun against the adjacent British unit, and that will cost the Axis 3 movement points for the overrun, plus the cost of the terrain, which is 1 movement point, for a total of 4 movement points. So therefore, the Axis unit has moved so far 6 movement points. And now we resolve the overrun, which is resolved as regular combat. 21 attacking factors against 5 defending, that's 4 to 1. Let's say that the die roll is a 4, and the result is 0/2, meaning that the attackers suffer no step losses, the defenders suffer 2. The British player decides to satisfy the 2 step losses by retreating its defending unit 2 hexes, and it retreats the unit in the direction of its supply source. The victorious German units occupy the vacated hex, but cannot advance 1 extra hex they're entitled to because they entered the zones of control of other British units. But remember that we're in the movement phase, and there's at least 6 more movement points that the German can use with this stack. So he declares another overrun against the British infantry brigade with a strength of 4. The Germans have now expended 10 movement points. Let's say that in this combat result, another 0/2 result was obtained, and the British also retreated the defending unit. The Germans occupied the vacated hex, and they have to stop again because of the zone of control of a different Allied unit. The Germans, not having enough movement points for another overrun, have to stop there. Note that the overrunning tactic is powerful and useful, but can leave the overrunning units exposed if they go too far. Also, it is important to note that overrunning units can continue to perform overruns in a phase if they have sufficient movement points. However, if they receive a negative result that is satisfied by them having to retreat, that ends their movement phase. Combat is mandatory in this game between adjacent enemy units. So in this example, we see 3 Axis combat units attacking 1 British infantry brigade, and the Axis have the Rommel headquarters unit. The odds, 15-4, are simplified and rounded off in favor of the defender to 3-1. However, the Rommel headquarters unit gives the Axis 1 favorable column shift to the right. So the attack would be resolved in the 4-1 column. But before resolving the attack, each player has a chance to assign air points to the attack and defense. The Axis start each turn with 12 air points and the Allies with 6. Let's say that the Axis player decides to assign 1 air point to this attack. We subtract 1 from the track, and 1 air point is added to the combat strength of the Axis units. It's now 16-4, 4-1 plus the Rommel column shift. It is now 5-1. But the defender has a chance of allocating air points after the attacker does so, and the British decide to assign 2 air points to the defense. And the air points are reduced by moving the marker to the number 4 box. So 2 points are added to the defense, and now it is 16-6, which is 2-1, and when we take into account the Rommel headquarters column shift, we see that the attack is going to finally be resolved in the 3-1 column. A die is rolled and a 3 is obtained, 0/1. So the Axis suffer no step losses. The Allies have to satisfy a 1 step loss, and they can do it 2 ways. They can reduce the unit by flipping it to its back side, in which case it stays put in the hex where it is, or the British can retreat the unit, in which case it is retreated 1 hex in the direction of its supply source, and the victorious German units, if they want to, they can occupy the vacated hex. And we saw that in this example, the advancing units only advance 1 hex because the retreating units only retreated 1 hex. Now let's say that the defending unit suffered a 2 step loss result and decided to retreat 2 hexes. In this case, the victorious units can advance 2 hexes, and the units advance into the vacated hex, and the second hex advance can be any hex into which the unit wants to move. And here we see moving in the direction of where the British unit is. Let's say that the British unit was destroyed through an elimination result. So the rules state that in those cases, the victorious units can advance 3 hexes, and they can ignore costs of terrain like the Minefield. As to air points, there's an optional rule by which the British can lose air points, and that is 2 air points if they lose control of each of the following hexes: Tobruk, El Adem, and Bir El Gobi. In this game, the sides receive replacements, but only beginning in turn 4. Beginning on turn 4, each player may, during any 3 friendly replacement phases, flip a previously reduced non-tank unit to its full side. Or the player may return a previously destroyed non-tank unit to the map by placing it in one of its supply source hexes. The replacement of tank units in this game is handled differently. Every time a tank unit receives a step loss, that is recorded on the armor loss track. Let's say that one of the British armored units received a step loss and was inverted. We record that step loss by moving the losses marker to the number 1 box. Whenever the losses marker reaches the number 3 box on the Allied armor loss track, we move the marker back to 0 and record 1 Allied recovery point. On the other hand, when the Axis losses marker reaches the number 4 box, we move the marker back to the 0 box and record 1 recovery point for the Axis. And recovery points are used to bring back previously destroyed tank units to their reduced side, or to flip a reduced tank unit to its full strength side. The winner of the game is determined on victory points, and victory points are scored mostly for the reduction or elimination of enemy units, but the schedule for Allied and Axis units is not the same. Whenever an Allied unit is reduced, the Axis player receives 1 victory point. If an Axis unit is reduced, the Allied player receives 2 victory points. If a reduced Allied unit is eliminated, the Axis receives 2 points. And if a reduced Axis unit is eliminated, the British receive 3 victory points. If a full-strength Allied unit is eliminated, the Axis receives 3 victory points. If a full-strength Axis unit is eliminated, the Allies receive 5 victory points. If Tobruk is captured by the Axis side by the end of the game, the Axis receive 25 victory points. So as you can see, the game places a premium on the Axis player to capture Tobruk while avoiding substantial casualties. Let's play one turn of Rommel at Gazala, and we will explain the different mechanics of the game as they develop. Let's take a look first at the British defenses. In the Tobruk fortified zone, we see both brigades of the 2nd South African Infantry Division and 1 brigade of the 5th Indian Infantry Division. To the west of Tobruk, there's a line of 3 boxes, occupied by the 3 brigades of the 1st South African Division. To the south of that position, we see 2 more boxes, occupied by both brigades of the 50th British Infantry Division. And right behind is the 32nd Army Tank Brigade. Continuing to the south, we see another box occupied by the remaining brigade of the British 50th Infantry Division. And moving further to the south, there's the box at Bir Hakeim, defended by the Free French Infantry Brigade. Close nearby are units of the British 7th Armored Division, which are guarding the southern flank. Now we move into the vicinity of Knightsbridge, where we see the 3 brigades of the British 1st Armored Division, and at Sidi Mufta, an independent brigade, the 1st Army Tank Brigade. And finally, to the northwest of Bir el Gobi is the 29th Brigade of the 5th Indian Infantry Division. And that completes the initial positions of the British 8th Army. The Africa Corps has a regiment of the 90th Light Division to the northeast of Bir Temrad. To the southeast of Bir Temrad and in front of the British box positions, there are two Italian infantry divisions, the Sabraza and the Trento infantry divisions. Continuing south, we see across from the British 50th Infantry Division the Italian Brescia Infantry Division. And further to the south, occupying an important crossroads, is the Pavia Infantry Division. The Axis players given discretion where to set up the remaining units, which are the bulk of the Axis mobile forces, the German 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, the two remaining regiments of the 90th Light Division, all three independent German units, and we have the two regiments of the Italian Ariete Armored Division and the Trieste Motorized Division. These units may be placed anywhere to the west of these minefield hex sides and to the north of hexes that end with the number 14. So they have to be placed anywhere in this area. The Africa Corps has to make a choice whether it will go through the minefields. And remember that the minefields have a disadvantage in that they cost half of a unit's movement allowance to cross, and once the unit crosses it, in the next supply phase, it will be unsupplied unless it can trace a line through a minefield gap, and those are very hard to come by, needing a 1 with a 1d6. The other alternative, which is the historical route, is that Rommel can set up his most powerful mobile units here and outflank the Gazala line from the south and take on these British units, then push north to Knightsbridge, where combat will ensue with another British armored division, and then break through to take the prize of Tobruk. So with that strategy in mind, let's complete the Axis setup. The Trieste Motorized Infantry Division sets in front of the sole brigade of the 50th British Infantry Division occupying a box. And will set up both regiments of the Italian Ariete Armored Division to the south of that box so they can plug the gap in the line and also prevent any gaps that may develop with the advance of the German mobile forces. The 15th German Panzer Division, with its 3 regiments, sets up here 2 hexes to the west of Bir Hakeim. And right next to it, the German 21st Panzer Division with its 3 regiments. We set up now the free stacking units. The anti-aircraft battalion goes with the German 15th Panzer Division and the anti-tank battalion with the 21st, and will also place the Rommel headquarters with the 21st. The independent reconnaissance battalion will set nearby, and the 2 remaining regiments of the German 90th Light Division will set up here in the gap between the Italian divisions and will act as a reserve. And that completes the initial setup of both the Allied and the Axis forces. We're ready to commence with this first turn. The game turn marker goes in the number 1 space, and we have the Allied armored loss marker as well as the Axis armor loss marker in 0, as well as both recovery markers. We record the initial allotment of air points, record the initial number of air points, the Axis 12, and the British 6. And we start with the Axis turn, and the first phase is the supply phase. We check for supply for both sides. We can see that all Axis units can trace an unobstructed line of supply to these hexes that have these red pegs there that we have marked previously as Axis supply sources. So at the beginning of the game, no Axis units are unsupplied. We also trace supply for the Allied units, and we can see that Allied units can trace unobstructed lines of supply to the eastern edge of the map where they have their 3 supply source hexes. Next is the replacement phase, and as per the rules, none of the sides may take replacements before game turn 4. This is the first game turn, so we skip this phase. And we go now to the Axis movement phase. And we will begin with the movement of both German armored or panzer divisions that are in the vicinity of Bir Hakeim. And to start the Axis movement phase, we will move the 21st Panzer Division together with the Rommel headquarters unit, and there's an anti-tank battalion, also a free stacking unit there. The slowest unit is the Panzer Regiment with 12 movement points. So we start moving the whole stack 5 hexes next to the motorized infantry brigade. The Germans declare an overrun and they spend 4 additional movement points, 3 for the cost of the overrun and 1 for the cost of the hex where the defenders are located. And now we resolve the combat, and in overruns, air points cannot be used. The Germans have 22 combat factors and the Rommel headquarters unit. One of the units is a panzer unit which gives the Germans 1 shift to the right in the combat results table. So it's 22 combat factors against 4. We start with a 5-to-1, but the Rommel headquarters unit provides a shift to the right as well as the armored shift. But the highest column we have in the combat results table is the 6-to-1 column. So that will be the column where we will resolve this combat. We roll 1d6. The result is a 2. The attackers suffer a step loss and the defenders are eliminated. The defenders' result is applied first, so the defending motorized infantry brigade is eliminated. And now the Africa Corps player has to make a decision. He has to either suffer a step loss with one of his units or retreat all units 1 hex, and if he retreats, that will end the movement phase for this stack. So the decision is to take a step loss with one of the units. And among these units, there is a Panzer Grenadier battalion. So that unit will take the step loss. It is inverted to its reduced side, and now the stack can continue moving. The slowest unit in the stack is the Panzer Regiment with 12 movement points. So the stack will move 3 movement points to reach a position adjacent to the British Armour Brigade. And it has to stop there because it entered an enemy zone of control. And that concludes the movement of the German 21st Panzer Division. Note that in the combat phase, the Germans will have to attack that tank brigade, but of course they will bring more units to the attack. Next, the Germans will move this reconnaissance unit 9 hexes, 9 movement points to take this position here to protect the right flank of the advance. Next, we move the 15th Panzer Division, which is here, together with this free stacking anti-aircraft unit. We will show the slowest unit in the stack on top, which is the Panzer Regiment with 12 movement points. It will move 7 movement points to move adjacent to the British Tank Brigade. Note that it has enough movement points remaining to declare an overrun against the British Tank Brigade, but it would be a 2-to-1 situation, So we will forgo the overrun, and that completes the movement of that panzer division. Now we move both regiments of the Ariete division to this area to take up positions here to seal the line. And now we move this Italian motorized infantry division also to this hex to plug any gaps. We continue moving our units. The Pavia division moves here. The Brescia infantry division moves to this position here on this crossroads adjacent to these minefields. In the next turn, that unit may search for a gap in the minefields. We take one of the Panzer Grenadier regiments from the German 90th Division and move it here. And this other regiment of the 90th Light Division moves 2 hexes to the southeast. And we finish by moving this Italian division 3 hexes to this position. And that ends the Axis movement phase. We only have one attack in the combat phase. The 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions attacking a brigade of the 7th British Division. The Germans have 42 strength points to the British 8, so that is 5-1, and with the Rommel headquarters unit, that is a 6-1 attack. Now the Germans must decide whether to employ any air points in attack, and they have 12, the British have 6, and obviously the amount of air points that the British may apply after the Germans apply theirs may change the odds differential. So the Germans, to make it a little bit more interesting for the British, will spend 6 of their 12 air points in this attack. So we place the German marker in the number 6 box. Now it's 48-8, which is 6-1, plus the Rommel shift, that would be 7-1. The British decide to use all of their 6 air points. They're left with 0. So now it's 48-14. And that is 3-1, but with the column shift for the Rommel headquarters, it is a final 4-1 odds column. So we roll 1d6, and the roll is a 5. Each side loses 1 step. So the British decide first whether they lose a step or retreat 1 hex, and the British decide to retreat. Now the Germans must decide either to lose a strength point or retreat all of their units 1 hex, and being so costly, the strength points for the Germans, they will retreat 1 hex. And that's the end of the German combat phase. And now we move to the Allied player's turn. So now we move on to the Allied turn, and the first phase is the supply phase. And as we can see here, all units from both sides can trace unobstructed supply lines to their respective supply sources. The axis to those hexes marked with red pegs to the west, and the Allies can trace supply lines to their supply sources on the eastern edge of the map. Next to the replacement phase, but we're still in turn number 1, so no replacements can be taken on the Allied side in this turn. Now to the movement phase, and there is a gap developing here in the southern part of the front. There is a minefield here. The Axis could theoretically go into the minefield, but if they remain in the minefield, they will become unsupplied during the next supply phase. So it is a risky proposition to break the front there. We see here that there is another gap in the line here. So Allied units will have to come to the rescue and form a front. And there are the elements here of the 1st British Tank Division, which are nearby, so they will be able to join in the defense, and this brigade of the 5th Indian Infantry Division. So we start by moving this infantry brigade to this hex here. It's important to note that the Germans still have 6 air points which they could use in defense in this turn. So the British are not really looking to make any counterattacks, but just to plug the gaps. This tank brigade will move south to this position here. And this other tank brigade will also take a southerly course to move to this hex here. So the front line has been sealed, but with the German panzer units in proximity, one line of defense, of course, is not enough. This infantry support tank unit will take this route here and will move right next to Bir el Hamad. The other infantry support tank, which is with units here of the 50th British Infantry Division, will move to this position here and block the road to Sidi Mufta. And that concludes the British movement phase. There are no combat situations, so that is the end of the first turn, and that is where this video will end, right here. So as you can see, the Germans have a tough proposition. Now they have to break through a line of armored brigades blocking the path to Knightsbridge and from there to Tobruk. But of course, the Desert Fox always has some tricks up his sleeve. So can Rommel break through the line of British armored brigades near Bir Hakeim? Will the French surrender the strong point? Will the British fight until the last Frenchman? Or will they defeat Rommel and stop him from taking Tobruk? Well, to find out, play Rommel at Gazala. This is the conclusion of this video. This game has low counter density, and you can see that there's a lot of space for maneuvering. And in certain ways, warfare in the desert is somewhat similar to war at sea, where ships can take positions behind enemy ships and circle around enemy formations. Here in the desert, there is space for that, but at the end, it is the landmark of Tobruk that needs to be defended if you are playing the British, or taken if you are the Africa Corps player, because the uneven victory point schedule in terms of casualties favors the British in this game. So I hope that this video has given you a good idea of how this game plays and what the game has to offer. This is Stuka Joe, signing off for now. Thanks for watching.